The rolling hills of Kentucky stretched endlessly, a picture-perfect backdrop to Carter's stables, one of the most prestigious horse farms in the country. Known for producing championship thoroughbreds, the farm was William Carter's pride and legacy. At 58, William was a man hardened by years of relentless work and ambition. His sharp blue eyes, framed by graying hair, had seen both triumph and sacrifice in his quest to build his empire. One early spring morning, the anticipation around the barn was palpable. Magnolia Grace, the farm's crown jewel, a mare whose lineage was unparalleled, was in labor. Stable hands whispered excitedly about the foal that would surely become another legend in the Carter stables lineage. As the foal arrived, a collective gasp filled the barn. The colt was a striking white, his coat gleaming under the soft light filtering through the wooden beams. His delicate frame was a stark contrast to his mother's robust figure, but his beauty was undeniable. Dr. Thompson, the farm's longtime veterinarian, stepped into the stall. He was a kind man in his 60s, with a weathered face that told of decades spent caring for animals. As he examined the colt, his expression shifted subtly, a flicker of concern he tried to mask. William's imposing figure loomed over him. "Well, Doc, what's the verdict?" Dr. Thompson hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Mr. Carter, the foal, he's blind. Both eyes. There's no chance of recovery." A heavy silence blanketed the barn. The stable hands exchanged uneasy glances, knowing how William valued perfection above all else. The colt, oblivious to the judgment hanging over him, stumbled clumsily toward his mother, guided by her soothing whinnies. William's face hardened. His expression was unreadable, but his voice was cold and decisive. "Blind?" he repeated, as if testing the word. Dr. Thompson nodded solemnly. "It's a rare condition. He'll never race, Mr. Carter, and he'll require special care for the rest of his life." William's jaw tightened. To him, the colt was a failed investment, a burden that had no place on his farm. "We don't have the resources to waste on a horse that can't compete," he said flatly. "Take care of it. I don't want it here." The words were a death sentence. Several stable hands shifted uncomfortably, but no one dared to challenge William's authority. He turned on his heel and strode out of the barn, his boots echoing against the wooden floor. Dr. Thompson sighed heavily, his heart sinking. He glanced at the colt, who nuzzled against Magnolia Grace's side, seeking comfort in her warmth. The veterinarian couldn't argue with William. It wasn't his place, but the thought of ending this young life weighed on him. One of the stable hands, a younger man named Sam, stepped forward. His brown eyes were filled with both fear and resolve. "Dr. Thompson," he whispered, "if we're supposed to take care of him, maybe there's another way. Maybe we can just let him go." Dr. Thompson hesitated but nodded. "It's not what Mr. Carter asked for, but I can't bring myself to end it either. If you're willing, Sam, take him out to the forest. At least he'll have a chance out there." That evening, under the cover of twilight, Sam led the blind colt into the nearby woods. The colt stumbled over roots and uneven ground, his every step unsure. Sam's heart ached as he watched the defenseless animal. He stopped near a clearing, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm sorry, little guy," he murmured. "It's the best I can do." He left quickly, unable to bear the sight of the colt standing alone in the darkening forest. The forest was alive with the hum of evening sounds, crickets chirping, leaves rustling in the gentle breeze, and the occasional hoot of an owl. The white colt stood trembling in the clearing, his legs splayed awkwardly, his head tilting as he tried to make sense of the world around him. Darkness didn't matter to him. His world had always been dark. What unnerved him was the silence of his mother, the absence of her comforting warmth. Hours passed, and the colt's cries of distress echoed through the trees. He called for Magnolia Grace, his voice soft at first, then rising to desperate whinnies. But the mare did not come. The forest, indifferent to his plight, seemed to grow colder as the night deepened. Not far from the clearing, Ethan Miller was making his way home along the forest trail. A 12-year-old boy with a lean frame and a mop of messy brown hair, Ethan loved exploring these woods. They were his sanctuary, a place where he could escape the chaos of his small-town life. Tonight, however, something felt different. He slowed his steps, his keen ears catching the faint sound of an animal in distress. Ethan paused, straining to hear. A horse? Out here? He followed the sound, his sneakers crunching against the forest floor. As he neared the source, he pushed through a thicket of branches and stumbled into the clearing. There, in the pale glow of moonlight, stood the colt. Ethan froze, his breath catching in his throat. He had never seen a horse so beautiful or so vulnerable. The animal's pure white coat seemed to shimmer, but its movements were hesitant, almost clumsy. The colt turned its head toward him, ears twitching at the sound of Ethan's approach. "Hey there," Ethan said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. He stepped closer, his movements slow and deliberate. "It's okay. I'm not gonna hurt you." The colt flinched but didn't run. It seemed more confused than frightened, as though it couldn't decide whether Ethan was a threat or a savior. Ethan crouched low, extending a hand. "You're lost? Huh? Where's your mom?" As the boy observed the colt more closely, the truth dawned on him. The foal's cloudy eyes stared blankly ahead, unfocused and unseeing. Ethan felt a pang of sadness. "You're blind," he murmured. The colt nickered softly, an almost questioning sound that tugged at Ethan's heart. He stood slowly, glancing around the clearing. No signs of other horses, no hoof prints leading away. It didn't take much to piece together what had happened. Someone had left the colt here, abandoned it to fend for itself. Anger flared in Ethan's chest, but he pushed it aside. What mattered now was helping the colt. He pulled off his hoodie, draping it over his arm. "All right, buddy, let's get you out of here," he said gently. He moved to the colt's side, guiding it with light touches on its neck. The animal hesitated but didn't resist. The journey back to Ethan's house was slow and arduous. The colt stumbled often, its legs unsteady on the uneven terrain. Ethan spoke to it constantly, his voice calm and reassuring. "You're doing great. Just a little further. We'll get you safe, I promise." When they finally reached the edge of the forest, Ethan's modest home came into view, a weathered single-story house with peeling paint and a small yard. The porch light cast a warm glow, and Ethan felt a surge of relief. "We're here," he told the colt. "Welcome home." He led the foal to the backyard, where a patch of grass and a rickety shed offered some semblance of shelter. Ethan patted the colt's neck. "I'll be right back. Gotta get you some water." Inside the house, Ethan's mother, Sarah Miller, was washing dishes. A woman in her late 30s with tired eyes and a kind smile. She glanced up as Ethan burst through the door. "Mom, I found a horse," he blurted out, his voice a mix of excitement and urgency. Sarah set down the dish she was holding. "What do you mean, you found a horse? Where?" "In the woods. He's blind, Mom. Someone just left him there." Ethan's eyes shone with a mix of anger and determination. "We can't just leave him. Can we keep him?" "Please," Sarah sighed, drying her hands on a towel. She knew Ethan's heart was in the right place, but taking in a horse, especially one with special needs, was no small task. "Ethan, we can barely make ends meet as it is. A horse is a big responsibility." "I'll take care of him," Ethan promised, his voice fierce. "I'll feed him, train him, everything. Just give him a chance." "Please, Mom." Sarah looked into her son's eyes and saw the same stubbornness that had often driven her crazy, but also made her proud. After a long moment, she nodded. "All right, but this is your responsibility, Ethan. You understand?" Ethan nodded vigorously. "I swear, Mom, you won't regret it." With that, he hurried back outside, a grin spreading across his face. The colt lifted its head at the sound of his approach, and Ethan patted its neck. "You're safe now," he said softly. "I'm gonna call you Bright. How's that sound?" The colt nickered again, as if in agreement, and Ethan smiled. Bright had found a home, and Ethan had found a purpose. Ethan woke before dawn the next morning, his excitement pushing aside the usual grogginess that came with early mornings. He hurried to the backyard, his breath visible in the chilly air. Bright was lying in the grass, his legs tucked awkwardly beneath him, his ears flicking toward every rustle and chirp in the pre-dawn stillness. At the sound of Ethan's approaching footsteps, Bright raised his head and nickered softly. "Good morning, Bright," Ethan said, crouching beside the colt. He gently ran a hand along Bright's neck, marveling at the softness of his coat. "You hungry? Let's see what we can do about that." The Miller household wasn't equipped for livestock. The shed in the backyard was more of a tool storage space than a barn, and there wasn't a single bale of hay in sight. Ethan rummaged through the kitchen pantry, pulling out a box of oats. "Mom, do horses eat plain oats?" he asked, holding up the box. Sarah, still in her robe and sipping her first cup of coffee, glanced at him with a mixture of amusement and concern. "They can, but that's not enough to keep him healthy. You'll need to find proper feed, Ethan." Ethan nodded, already forming a plan. "I'll figure it out," he said. He poured the oats into a small bucket and headed back outside. Bright sniffed the bucket tentatively before nudging it with his nose. Encouraged, Ethan held the bucket steady as the colt began to eat. "That's it," he murmured. "You've got to eat if you're gonna get stronger." Over the next few days, Ethan devoted every spare moment to Bright. He cleaned out the shed, making room for the colt to have a proper shelter. Using old blankets and scrap wood, he fashioned a makeshift stall inside. It wasn't much, but it was warm and safe. At school, Ethan could hardly focus on his lessons. His mind was always on Bright, wondering if the colt was managing without him. During lunch, he pored over library books about horse care, jotting down notes on everything from nutrition to grooming. By the end of the week, Ethan had scrounged enough odd jobs around the neighborhood to afford a bag of proper horse feed. He hauled it home on his bike, his arms and legs aching but his spirits high. "See, Bright," he said, pouring the feed into a trough he'd built. "Told you I'd take care of you." Caring for Bright wasn't without its challenges. The colt's blindness made him skittish, and he often shied away from sudden noises or unexpected touches. Ethan learned to move slowly around him, speaking softly to reassure him. One evening, as Ethan was brushing Bright's coat, Sarah came outside to watch. She leaned against the porch railing, a small smile tugging at her lips. "You're really serious about this, aren't you?" she asked. Ethan looked up, his hands still on the brush. "He depends on me, Mom. I can't let him down." Sarah nodded, her heart swelling with pride. "You've got a good heart, Ethan. Just remember, this is a long-term commitment. Bright's going to need you for years to come." "I know," Ethan said, his voice firm, "and I'll be there for him, no matter what." As the days turned into weeks, Bright began to adapt to his new environment. He learned to recognize Ethan's voice and footsteps, responding with a soft nicker whenever the boy approached. Ethan discovered that Bright was incredibly smart. He could navigate the backyard using subtle cues, like the feel of grass under his hooves or the sound of wind through the trees. Ethan also started introducing Bright to new experiences. He walked the colt around the yard, gently guiding him with a rope. At first, Bright was hesitant, his steps unsteady. But Ethan's patience and encouragement paid off. "You're doing great, Bright," he said one afternoon as the colt completed a full lap around the yard without stumbling. "See? You're stronger than you think." Bright seemed to thrive under Ethan's care. His coat grew shinier, his movements more confident. And as the bond between boy and colt deepened, Ethan began to see Bright not as a burden, but as a partner. Bright wasn't just a horse. He was a testament to resilience, a living reminder that even in the face of adversity, strength and hope could prevail. By now, Bright had become an integral part of Ethan's daily life. The once fragile colt had grown stronger, his legs steadier, and his demeanor more relaxed in Ethan's presence. But Ethan knew Bright's progress couldn't stop at simply surviving. The colt needed to thrive, and that meant training, not for races or competition, but to navigate the world confidently despite his blindness. One crisp Saturday morning, Ethan stood in the backyard with Bright, holding a small rope halter he'd borrowed from a neighbor. The colt stood nearby, his ears swiveling to catch every sound. "All right, Bright," Ethan said softly. "Time to take things up a notch." Ethan slipped the halter over Bright's head, his movements slow and deliberate. Bright flinched slightly at the unfamiliar sensation, but Ethan's soothing voice calmed him. "It's okay, boy. I'm right here. You trust me, don't you?" Bright nickered softly, a sound that Ethan liked to imagine was agreement. He gently tugged on the lead rope, encouraging the colt to follow him. At first, Bright resisted, planting his hooves firmly in the dirt. "Come on, Bright," Ethan coaxed, his voice steady. "You can do this." Bright hesitated, his head turning toward Ethan's voice. Then, tentatively, he took a step forward. Ethan beamed. "That's it. Good boy." The first training sessions were slow and cautious. Ethan used his voice and touch to guide Bright, rewarding him with gentle pats and soothing words whenever he completed a task. Over time, the colt began to trust Ethan implicitly. He followed the sound of Ethan's voice without hesitation, relying on the boy to lead him safely. Ethan also introduced new challenges to help Bright build confidence. He created a small obstacle course in the backyard using overturned buckets, wooden planks, and old tires. Guiding Bright through the course was a test of patience and perseverance for both of them. "Okay, Bright," Ethan said one afternoon, leading the colt to the start of the course. "There's a tire in front of you. Lift your hoof, just like that." "Good job." Bright stumbled a few times, his legs awkwardly navigating the unfamiliar terrain. But Ethan never lost his patience. Each mistake was met with encouragement, not frustration. "It's okay," he said, kneeling beside the colt after a misstep. "We'll try again. You're doing amazing." By the end of the month, Bright could navigate the course with surprising ease. Ethan watched with pride as the colt stepped carefully over the obstacles, guided only by the boy's voice and touch. It was a triumph, not just for Bright, but for Ethan as well. Their progress didn't go unnoticed. One evening, Sarah stood at the kitchen window, watching as Ethan and Bright worked together in the fading light. She couldn't help but smile. Her son's determination and compassion had transformed the colt from a helpless, abandoned animal into a creature full of life and potential. "You've done something incredible with him, Ethan," she said later that night as they sat at the dinner table. "Bright's not just surviving. He's thriving because of you." Ethan shrugged, his face flushing with modesty. "I just believed in him, Mom. That's all." But deep down, Ethan knew it was more than that. Bright had become his partner, his confidant, and his responsibility. The colt depended on him, and in turn, Ethan found strength and purpose he hadn't known he possessed. One evening, as they rested in the backyard after a long training session, Ethan sat beside Bright, leaning against the colt's warm flank. The stars glittered above them, and the forest buzzed with the sounds of nighttime. "You know, Bright," Ethan said softly, "you're not just my project or my pet. You're my friend. And I promise, no matter what happens, I'll always be here for you." Bright nickered in response, his head nudging Ethan's shoulder. It was a small gesture, but it meant everything to the boy. Together, they had overcome so much. And together, they would face whatever challenges lay ahead. Ethan's work with Bright had become a routine, but it wasn't without its share of challenges, some of which extended far beyond the colt's blindness. Word about Ethan's unusual companion began to spread through the small town of Oak Ridge, where news traveled fast and opinions were freely given. It started with whispers at school. During lunch breaks, Ethan overheard snippets of conversations. "Did you hear about Ethan Miller?" a boy at the next table said. "He's wasting his time with some blind horse." "Why bother?" another chimed in. "A horse like that is useless." Ethan clenched his fists but kept his head down, choosing to focus on his sandwich instead of their words. He knew what they thought. To them, Bright was just another mouth to feed, an animal that couldn't race, work, or contribute to anything meaningful. The gossip wasn't limited to school. At the local feed store, where Ethan occasionally stopped to buy supplies, the store clerk, an older man named Hank, leaned on the counter and gave him a bemused look. "You're still taking care of that blind colt, huh?" "Yes, sir," Ethan replied, keeping his tone polite. Hank shook his head. "Ain't nothing but a waste of time, son. You can't fix something like that. Better off finding a horse with some real potential." Ethan forced a smile, paid for the bag of feed, and walked out without another word. Inside, though, he felt a flicker of doubt. Could they be right? Was he wasting his time? At home, he shared his frustrations with his mother as they washed the dinner dishes. "Why do people care so much about what I'm doing with Bright?" he asked, scrubbing a plate with unnecessary force. Sarah set down a glass and turned to face him. People will always have opinions, Ethan. Especially when you're doing something they don't understand. She placed a hand on his shoulder. But what matters is what you believe. Do you think Bright is worth it? Ethan nodded without hesitation. Of course I do. Then that's all that matters, Sarah said firmly. Don't let their words shake you. The criticism wasn't universal, though. A few neighbors stopped by to admire Bright and commend Ethan for his efforts. Mrs. Callahan, an elderly woman who lived down the road, often brought over scraps of apples and carrots for the colt. You've got a good heart, Ethan, she said one afternoon as Bright eagerly munched on the treats. Not everyone would see the worth in a horse like this. But you do, and that makes all the difference. Despite the mixed reactions, Ethan stayed focused on Bright's training. He had learned to tune out the naysayers, though their words occasionally lingered in the back of his mind. What kept him going was the bond he had built with Bright, a connection that no one else could understand. One day, while Ethan was walking Bright around the neighborhood, a group of boys from school approached. Their leader, Jake, was a tall, broad-shouldered teenager who loved to make his presence known. He smirked as he saw Ethan holding Bright's lead rope. "Still playing cowboy with your blind horse, huh?" Jake taunted, his friends chuckling behind him. Ethan stopped, his grip tightening on the rope. "He's not just a horse," he said evenly. "He's my friend." Jake snorted. "Your friend? That's pathetic. He'll never be anything but a liability." Ethan felt his cheeks flush with anger, but he refused to rise to the bait. "You don't know anything about him," he said quietly. Then he turned and walked away, Bright following closely behind. That evening, as he brushed Bright's coat, Ethan replayed the encounter in his mind. The doubt crept back, gnawing at him. Was Jake right? Was he putting all this effort into something that would never amount to anything? Bright, as if sensing Ethan's turmoil, nudged the boy's shoulder with his head. Ethan smiled faintly, scratching behind the colt's ears. "Thanks, Bright," he murmured. "I needed that." He decided then and there that he wouldn't let anyone's words dictate what he could achieve with Bright. The colt had already proven that he was capable of so much more than people gave him credit for. Ethan just needed to keep believing and working. The next morning, Ethan stood in the backyard, looking at Bright with renewed determination. "We're gonna show them," he said. "We're gonna prove them all wrong. You and me, Bright. We've got this." Bright nickered in response, his ears twitching toward Ethan's voice. The colt couldn't see the doubt in Ethan's eyes or the smirk on Jake's face, but he could feel the unwavering resolve in the boy's touch. Together, they would face the challenges ahead, one step at a time. The morning of the town's annual harvest fair dawned crisp and cool, the scent of autumn leaves and hay lingering in the air. For as long as Ethan could remember, the fair had been the highlight of Oak Ridge's calendar, a celebration of community, tradition, and, most importantly, the local horse show. This year, however, the event carried an extra layer of significance for Ethan. For the first time, he and Bright would be competing. The idea had come to him after weeks of training. It wasn't about winning. Ethan knew Bright couldn't compete in a traditional race or obstacle course. Instead, he signed up for the freestyle category, where handlers could showcase their horses' unique talents. Ethan saw it as an opportunity, not just for Bright to shine, but to prove to the doubters that his colt was more than his blindness. As Ethan led Bright into the fairgrounds, he could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on them. The pair drew whispers and sideways glances from the crowd. "Isn't that the blind horse?" someone muttered. "What's he doing here?" Ethan straightened his shoulders, his jaw tightening. Bright, oblivious to the scrutiny, walked calmly beside him, his ears flicking toward Ethan's soothing words. "You're gonna do great, Bright," Ethan murmured. "Just like we practiced." The competition arena was a simple dirt ring bordered by wooden fences, with bleachers filled with spectators. Ethan took a deep breath as he and Bright stepped into the ring. The announcer introduced them with a hint of skepticism in his voice. Next up, Ethan Miller and Bright, a blind colt. A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd. Ethan ignored them, focusing solely on Bright. He had spent weeks choreographing their routine, carefully designing it to highlight the bond they had built. It began simply, with Ethan leading Bright in a figure-8 pattern using only his voice and gentle tugs on the lead rope. "Good boy," Ethan said softly as Bright followed the cues flawlessly. The crowd quieted, their curiosity peaked. Next, Ethan guided Bright through a series of obstacles they had practiced endlessly in their backyard. A low jump, a set of cones, and a narrow wooden bridge. Each step was deliberate, each movement a testament to the trust between boy and colt. When Bright hesitated at the bridge, Ethan knelt beside him, placing a reassuring hand on his neck. "You can do this, Bright. I'm right here." Bright sniffed the air, his ears twitching as if weighing the decision. Then, with a tentative step, he crossed the bridge. A smattering of applause broke out from the bleachers. The final part of their routine was the riskiest. Ethan had trained Bright to rear on command, a gesture that was as much about trust as it was about skill. He stood a few feet away, holding his arms wide. "Bright, up," he called. For a moment, Bright stood motionless. Then, as if sensing the significance of the moment, he rose onto his hind legs, his front hooves pawing the air. The crowd erupted into cheers and applause. Ethan's heart swelled with pride as Bright landed gracefully and walked toward him. He wrapped his arms around the colt's neck, whispering, "You were amazing, Bright. Absolutely amazing." After exiting the ring, Ethan and Bright were swarmed by spectators, many of whom had been skeptical just moments before. Mrs. Callahan beamed at them, clapping her hands. "You showed them, Ethan," she exclaimed. "You and Bright are a team to be reckoned with." Even the judges were impressed. While Ethan didn't win first place, he received a special recognition award for showcasing resilience and creativity. As he accepted the ribbon, the announcer's tone had shifted to one of admiration. "Ethan Miller and Bright have shown us all the power of trust and perseverance," he said. Later, as Ethan and Bright walked home, the ribbon tucked safely into Ethan's backpack, he couldn't help but feel a sense of triumph. The fair had been more than a competition. It had been a chance to change the way people saw Bright, to show them that even in the face of adversity, there was strength and potential. "You did it, Bright," Ethan said, patting the colt's neck. "We did it. And this is just the beginning." Bright nickered softly, his head turning toward Ethan's voice. In that moment, the boy and his colt were unstoppable. Together, they had defied the odds, and they weren't done yet. Ethan was in the backyard brushing Bright's coat when he first heard the sound of a truck pulling up the gravel driveway. The low rumble grew louder until it stopped near the house. Ethan frowned, setting the brush down. Visitors were rare, and uninvited ones were almost unheard of. Bright, sensing something unusual, lifted his head and flicked his ears, his body tense. Ethan walked around the house and froze when he saw the man stepping out of the truck. William Carter was as imposing as the stories had made him out to be. Tall and broad-shouldered, his sharp blue eyes surveyed the modest Miller home with an air of disdain. Dressed in a tailored jacket and polished boots, he looked entirely out of place in the dusty driveway. Sarah Miller stepped out onto the porch, her expression wary but polite. "Can I help you?" she asked. William removed his hat and offered a curt nod. "Mrs. Miller, I'm William Carter. I believe you've been harboring one of my horses." Ethan's stomach twisted. He stepped forward, his voice tight. "Bright isn't your horse anymore. You abandoned him." William turned to Ethan, his gaze cold and assessing. "Young man, that colt is from one of the finest lines in Kentucky. He belongs to me. He belongs to me now." Ethan shot back, his fists clenching at his sides. "You left him to die. I saved him." William's expression hardened. "I didn't authorize anyone to leave that horse in the woods. If my employees failed to follow orders, that's a matter I'll handle. But the fact remains, he's mine." Sarah stepped in, her voice calm but firm. "Mr. Carter, Ethan has cared for that colt for months. Bright is thriving here because of him. Surely you can see that." William's jaw tightened. "What I see is a valuable asset being wasted. That horse has potential, and I intend to make use of it." Ethan's voice cracked with frustration. "He's not an asset. He's my friend." For a moment, there was silence. Then William sighed, his tone softening slightly. "Look, boy, I'm willing to compensate you for your trouble. I'll pay you a fair price for the time and effort you've put into him." Ethan shook his head, his eyes blazing. "He's not for sale." The conversation had reached an impasse. William's expression darkened, and his voice turned icy. "Then I'll take this matter to court. That horse is legally mine, and I'll prove it." Ethan's heart sank, but he refused to back down. "Fine," he said, his voice shaking but determined. "We'll fight you." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of preparation. Sarah reached out to a local lawyer, Mr. Reynolds, who agreed to take the case. A kind man in his early 60s, he met with Ethan and Sarah at their kitchen table, listening intently as Ethan recounted how he had found Bright and nursed him back to health. "You've got a strong case," Mr. Reynolds said, adjusting his glasses. "Abandonment is a serious matter, and you've clearly provided for this colt. But William Carter has money and influence. This won't be an easy fight." Ethan nodded, his resolve unwavering. "I don't care how hard it is. Bright deserves better than to go back to someone who didn't want him." The court date arrived faster than Ethan expected. The small-town courthouse was packed, the community drawn by curiosity and the chance to see a local boy stand up to one of the region's most powerful men. Ethan sat beside Sarah and Mr. Reynolds, his palms sweaty but his determination intact. William's lawyer presented a polished argument, citing the colt's pedigree and the resources Carter stables could provide. But Mr. Reynolds countered with evidence of Bright's abandonment and the care Ethan had given him. Photos of the colt when Ethan first found him, thin and disoriented, contrasted starkly with the healthy, confident animal Bright had become. When Ethan took the stand, he spoke from the heart. "Bright isn't just a horse to me," he said, his voice steady despite the weight of the moment. "He's my friend. I've worked hard to help him, and he's worked just as hard to trust me. He's happy here, and I won't let anyone take that away." The courtroom fell silent as Ethan's words hung in the air. Even William Carter seemed momentarily taken aback, his usual stoic expression faltering. After hours of deliberation, the judge delivered the verdict. Ethan would retain custody of Bright. The court recognized the abandonment and the care Ethan had provided as grounds for ownership. Relief washed over Ethan as the judge's words sank in. He glanced at William, whose expression was a mixture of anger and resignation. But Ethan didn't gloat. He simply stood and walked over to Bright, who was waiting outside with Sarah. Wrapping his arms around the colt's neck, he whispered, "We did it, Bright. You're home for good." For the first time in months, Ethan felt the weight of worry lift from his shoulders. Bright was his, and no one could take him away. Their bond had been tested, but it had emerged stronger than ever, a testament to the power of love, trust, and unwavering determination. As Ethan stepped out of the courthouse, the cool autumn breeze greeted him, carrying with it the murmurs of the gathered crowd. The news of his victory had already spread through the small town, and the air was charged with a sense of justice. People who had once doubted him now looked at him with admiration and respect. Bright was waiting just outside, tethered to a fence post. He stood calm and patient, his ears twitching toward the sound of Ethan's footsteps. Ethan reached him and immediately wrapped his arms around the colt's neck. "We did it, Bright," he whispered, his voice trembling with emotion. "You're finally safe." Sarah joined them moments later, her eyes glistening with tears. She placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "I'm so proud of you," she said softly. "You stood up for what you believed in, and you won." Nearby, Mr. Reynolds, the family's lawyer, gave Ethan a small nod of approval. "Not many people would have the courage to take on someone like William Carter," he said. "You showed everyone what determination and heart can accomplish." The crowd began to disperse, but not before a few townspeople approached to congratulate Ethan. Even Mrs. Callahan, who had been a quiet supporter from the beginning, hobbled over to shake his hand. "You've done something incredible, Ethan," she said with a warm smile. "You gave that colt a chance, and you showed all of us what real kindness looks like." That evening, back at the Miller home, the mood was celebratory. Sarah prepared a special dinner, macaroni and cheese with homemade apple pie for dessert, Ethan's favorites. The house, usually quiet, buzzed with energy as neighbors dropped by to offer their congratulations. Even Ethan's classmates, who had once mocked him, sent messages of support. Ethan, however, spent most of the evening outside with Bright. The colt grazed peacefully in the backyard, seemingly unaware of the battle that had been fought and won on his behalf. Ethan leaned against the fence, watching him. For a moment, the world felt perfect, but perfection didn't last. Ethan's thoughts drifted to William Carter. He couldn't forget the man's expression in the courtroom, pride bruised, but not broken. Ethan had won this battle, but he knew William wasn't the type to let things go easily. "Bright," he said softly, "we've got to keep proving them wrong. Every day, we'll show them what you're capable of." "What we're capable of?" Bright lifted his head at the sound of Ethan's voice, nickered softly, and took a step closer. Ethan smiled, his resolve hardening. The fight for Bright had been difficult, but it was just the beginning of their journey together. In the weeks that followed, Ethan and Bright became something of a local legend. Their story spread throughout Oak Ridge, inspiring others in the community. Donations of hay, feed, and supplies poured in, easing the financial strain on the Millers. A local reporter even came by to interview Ethan, and the resulting article, titled "A Boy and His Colt: The Power of Resilience," was featured in the town's weekly newspaper. Ethan and Bright continued their training with renewed vigor. The colt, once clumsy and hesitant, now moved with confidence and grace under Ethan's guidance. They participated in small local events, each one building Bright's reputation and proving his worth to those who had doubted him. One particularly memorable day, as Ethan was leading Bright through a new obstacle course at a local riding club, he noticed someone watching from the sidelines. It was William Carter, leaning against a fence, his face unreadable. Ethan's heart raced, but he kept his focus on Bright. The colt navigated the course flawlessly, guided only by Ethan's voice and light touches on the lead rope. When they finished, the small crowd erupted into applause. As Ethan walked Bright back to the trailer, William approached. Ethan tensed, ready for another confrontation. But to his surprise, William extended a hand. "You've done well with him," William said, his tone begrudging but sincere. "Better than I would have expected." Ethan hesitated before shaking his hand. "He's not just a horse to me," he said firmly. "He's family." William nodded, his expression softening for a moment. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. Ethan watched him go, feeling a strange mix of emotions: relief, vindication, and even a flicker of respect. For the first time, it seemed that William Carter had acknowledged what Ethan had always known. Bright was more than his blindness, more than his pedigree. He was a symbol of resilience, love, and the extraordinary power of second chances. Ethan turned back to Bright, patting the colt's neck. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" he murmured. "And we're just getting started." Bright nickered softly, and together, they walked toward the horizon, ready to face whatever came next. Months turned into years, and the story of Ethan and Bright became woven into the fabric of Oak Ridge. What had begun as a quiet act of compassion grew into something much greater, a testament to the power of determination and the unbreakable bond between a boy and his horse. Bright, once discarded and doubted, had become a beacon of hope not just for Ethan, but for the entire community. Ethan, now 15, stood in a vast arena, the roar of the crowd echoing around him. This was their biggest event yet, a regional showcase for horses with unique stories. Ethan had entered Bright in a category for special needs animals, a growing platform for celebrating resilience and adaptability. The judges watched intently as Ethan guided Bright through their routine. It was a polished display of trust and skill, from intricate patterns to a carefully choreographed sequence of commands that showcased Bright's intelligence and responsiveness. When Ethan signaled for Bright to rear at the finale, the crowd erupted into applause, some even rising to their feet. Back in the stables after the performance, Ethan was approached by a man in a sharp suit carrying a clipboard. He introduced himself as the director of a foundation that paired children with special needs with therapy animals. "Your story with Bright is incredible," he said. "We'd like to feature you both in our program. Horses like Bright can change lives, and I think he's proof of that." Ethan beamed, his heart swelling with pride. "I'd love to help," he said. "Bright's done so much for me. I want to share that with others." In the following months, Ethan and Bright became ambassadors for the foundation, traveling to schools and events to share their story. Bright's calm demeanor and gentle nature made him an ideal therapy horse. He connected with children who faced their own struggles, from physical disabilities to emotional challenges. Ethan watched with amazement as Bright brought smiles to faces and comfort to hearts. One day, after a particularly moving visit to a children's hospital, Ethan sat beside Bright in their trailer. The colt, now a strong and confident horse, rested his head on Ethan's shoulder, as if sensing the emotions swirling in the boy's mind. "You've changed so many lives, Bright," Ethan whispered, "including mine." Back in Oak Ridge, the Miller family's modest home had become something of a landmark. People often stopped by to see Bright, bringing treats and asking about his latest adventures. Sarah, now a firm believer in the magic of second chances, often joked that Bright was the town's unofficial mascot. Ethan's schoolmates, once skeptical, had become some of his biggest supporters. Jake, the boy who had mocked him years earlier, even apologized one day. "You proved me wrong, Ethan," he admitted, extending a hand. "Bright's amazing, and so are you." Ethan accepted the handshake with a smile. "Thanks, Jake. It means a lot." Years later, Ethan would look back on his journey with Bright as the defining chapter of his life. The colt had taught him lessons no book or classroom ever could, about resilience, about seeing potential where others saw failure, and about the profound impact of unconditional love. Bright's story continued to inspire, even as he aged and slowed down. Ethan, now a young man, worked tirelessly to ensure that Bright's legacy endured. He established a small sanctuary for animals with special needs, a place where they could find safety, care, and purpose. As the sun set on the rolling hills of Kentucky one quiet evening, Ethan stood by the fence, watching Bright graze contentedly in the pasture. The horse, now an elder statesman among the sanctuary's residents, still carried himself with the quiet dignity that had won so many hearts. "You're a legend, Bright," Ethan said softly, his voice filled with gratitude. "And because of you, so many others will get the second chances they deserve." Bright nickered in response, his ears twitching toward the familiar sound of Ethan's voice. The boy and his colt had come full circle, their journey a shining example of hope, perseverance, and the extraordinary power of believing in what others had written off. And in the quiet of that Kentucky evening, with the stars beginning to glimmer in the vast sky above, their story lived on. An unspoken promise that every life, no matter how small or dismissed, has the potential to change the world. Years later, Ethan Miller's name had become synonymous with compassion and determination. The sanctuary he had established, aptly named Bright Futures Farm, had grown beyond even his wildest dreams. Nestled in the rolling hills of Kentucky, it spanned acres of lush pastures, comfortable barns, and dedicated spaces for animals with special needs. Horses, goats, dogs, and even a few rescued alpacas now called the sanctuary home. Ethan, now in his mid-20s, stood at the entrance of the farm as a school bus pulled up the gravel driveway. It was a sunny spring morning, and the air buzzed with the excited chatter of children. Today was one of the farm's open house events, where families, schools, and organizations visited to learn about the animals and hear their stories. As the children stepped off the bus, Bright stood nearby, his white coat glinting in the sunlight. Though he had aged, his presence was still striking, his movements graceful even as they had slowed over the years. Ethan often joked that Bright was the true star of the sanctuary. The children, many of them with visible physical challenges or shyness that spoke of deeper struggles, approached hesitantly at first. But Bright's gentle demeanor quickly drew them in. Ethan knelt beside the horse, encouraging them. "You can pet him," he said with a warm smile. "Bright loves making new friends." One boy, his legs supported by a brace, stepped forward and placed a tentative hand on Bright's neck. The horse nickered softly, leaning into the touch. The boy's face lit up with a smile that seemed to banish all hesitation. Ethan's heart swelled. Moments like this were why he had dedicated his life to this work. Bright's story continued to ripple outward, touching lives in ways Ethan could never have imagined. Later that afternoon, Ethan gathered the children and their families in a shaded pavilion. He stood at the front with Bright by his side, holding a microphone. Bright's story isn't just about a horse, he began, his voice steady and heartfelt. It's about seeing potential where others don't. It's about fighting for what you believe in, even when the odds are against you. He paused, looking out at the crowd. Bright was abandoned because he was blind, because someone thought he couldn't be useful. But he taught me, and so many others, that every life has value. That with love, patience, and a little faith, we can overcome even the biggest challenges. The audience listened intently, many nodding or wiping away tears. Ethan concluded with a smile. Bright changed my life, and I hope his story inspires you to see the world a little differently, to believe in the power of second chances. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Ethan walked Bright back to his favorite pasture. The horse nuzzled his hand affectionately, and Ethan chuckled. You've done so much, Bright. You've inspired so many. And you're still teaching me every day. Bright, as if understanding, gave a soft whinny. Ethan leaned against the fence, watching as the horse grazed peacefully. The sanctuary was quiet now, the visitors gone, but the energy of the day lingered. Ethan thought about the journey that had brought him here. The boy who had stumbled upon a blind colt in the woods and refused to give up on him. That decision had changed not just their lives, but countless others. Bright's legacy had grown into something Ethan could hardly fathom, a testament to the extraordinary impact of a single act of kindness. And as the first stars appeared in the sky, Ethan smiled, knowing their story was far from over. Bright's spirit would continue to shine, a beacon of hope and resilience for generations to come. Together, they had created something beautiful, something lasting, a legacy of love, perseverance, and unwavering belief in the power of second chances. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and check out this next story. It's truly heartwarming,